So we didn't quite make it onto the Mishnah in the middle of Chav Ches Amud Aleph. We have a few more lines. So in the English one, we'll be at 28A2, Amar of Yosef. So again, our Mishnah said, Rabbi Yehuda said, a person's allowed to weigh meat against a kli or against a cleaver, meaning you can't put, if you had a scale, you can't put the actual weights on one side and the meat on the other side on Yantif, because that's weighing a regular way. It looks like merchandise, all types of stuff. So Rabbi Yehuda says, instead of using a weight, you could put some type of kli or knife or whatever, cleaver, on the other side to see how much you bought. The Chachamim says you can't use a scale at all. So we were talking about, can a butcher just measure it? We talked about water displacement yesterday. Last time we spoke about just using his hand, or it seemed to be a machlokes. Could he put with one hand, he knows how much it is because he's an expert all the time, or he puts meat in one hand and something else in the other hand, and he weighs it that way, if that's mutter or not. So Amar Rav Yosef says halacha Rabbi Yeshua. Oh, so we said that there's a third opinion that's not in our Mishnah, but it's in Bechoros, and that's what is at the very top of 28A2, that Rabbi Yeshua says you could put one piece of meat against another piece of meat. So that would be actually a little bit more lenient than Rabbi Yehuda even. Rabbi Yehuda says you could put meat against a kli. Well, maybe it's a little bit stricter. Maybe it depends how you learn Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah. So it might be in between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda, or it might even be if Rabbi Yehuda allows you to weigh it against a vessel, he probably would. I would think that he would allow you to weigh it against another piece of meat, because that's less well defined than a kli, except the way the Gemara mentioned that we saw last week, it seems that he wouldn't allow that at all either. I'm Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef says, halacha Rabbi Yeshua, we pass in Rabbi Yeshua, ho l'tanan b'Bechoros kavase, because there's a Mishnah in Bechoros against, like Rabbi Yeshua, that there's a stam Mishnah that doesn't have any author like Rabbi Yeshua, so we pass like him. Did not, because we learned in a Mishnah there, psuli hamukdashim, an animal that was supposed to be as a korban, but now has a blemish that's permanently unable to be brought as a korban. Hanasan lahekdish. So if the value of the animal would increase, the hekdish benefits from the difference in value from what it was to what it is now. Vishoklin mana keneged mana b'bechor, and for bechor, you're allowed to see values of parts of a bechor, weighing it against another piece of meat, but not against other weighing things, because if you would weigh it, it would reduce the stature of a bechor, of something that's related to kachim. You're not allowed to weigh it in a regular way. So in bechor, you're allowed to weigh this amount of meat from a bechor against another piece of meat and indirectly calculate the weight, but you can't measure the weight directly through weighing it up for a scale. I want to point out, we learned a while ago, for Shemitah, stuff with Kedusha Shvius, you're not allowed to sell it normal way of counting or weighing or things like that. So even that's a lower level of these Psul Mikdashim, but that I think, because there's a special Gzeres HaKasav, a special drasha of Lachem V'lo L'Schora. The fruit, the Shemitah produce is for you to eat and not to sell. So, unfortunately, someone said that many Shemitahs ago, so they were able to get a whole bunch of stuff, but they were trying to split it up within their group. So they had these old-fashioned scale type things that they were trying to split it up. They missed the point that for the Shemitah produce, if you have it, just you try to say, okay, this much is yours, this much is yours, this much is yours, this much is yours. They shouldn't have tried to weigh it, but that's what they told me. So because in regard to Bechor, there's a Stam Mishnah, an anonymous Mishnah, it doesn't say anyone's opinion, we would follow that. So you could weigh it not using weights, just one piece of meat against another piece of meat, and determine it that way. Amarle Abaye says, no, you can't prove from the Mishnah Bechor that would apply on Chol Hamoed also. V'dilma lohi. Maybe that's not so, that we pass with Rabbi Yeshua just because there's a stam Mishnah Bechor. Ad kan lo kam Rabbi Yeshua hacha elo delek b'zayin kachim. Maybe Rabbi Yeshua is lenient on Yantif because there's not any lack of respect. Bizayon is a lack of respect to kachim, to a korban or bechor. So he would allow you to weigh it meat against meat. Aval hasam de ikabizayon kachim low. But maybe by bechor, he wouldn't even allow you weighing a piece of meat against another meat. Inami, or ad kan lo kami rabbanan hasan el mishum lo machzik uvni dechol. Maybe the Chachamim didn't prohibit weighing it in regard to bechor because it doesn't look like a weekday activity. Aval hacha, but here, when they were splitting up the fish between themselves, or the meat between themselves on Yantif mechzi to uvda dechol lo, it's similar to the way that you would split up the meat during the weekday. So the Chachamim would forbid this, even in the case of they're strict on Yantif, but they wouldn't be so strict in regard to the pasul korban or the bechor. So now the Gemara says Lamemer to kapti adadi. So this makes it sound like Rabbi and Rabbi Shimon ben Rabbi, who we saw last time, that they were splitting pieces of meat against other piece of meat to make sure that they split it equally. That seems that they were. Our school translate is particular. If you're of a kapeda, you have something against a person. It may not be a big thing, it may not be a little thing. If they were super duper good friends, okay, you got 4 pieces, I got 3 pieces, not a big deal, nishkaferlach. But the fact that they were trying to split it exactly showed, I don't want from you, you don't want from me. Now you could say from something we said about a month ago, sonem atanasichya. The one who hates gifts will live. So they wanted to split it out to reduce gifts, but that's not what the Gemara is saying. They seem to say that they weren't super friendly, meaning if you're super friendly, it seems that you would say, okay, no big deal. And this makes it sound like they weren't so close to each other. If you were because they weren't so close, they wanted to split it evenly or equally, right? So Vaha Han Hushev Benisa da Asu Leve Rebbe. There was a case when 7 fish were brought to Rebbe's house. Vishtaka Chamish B'nei Bei Reb Chia V'lo Kaped Rebbe Shimon Rebbe. And Reb Chia, 5 of them were given to Reb Chia, and Rebbe Shimon Rebbe wasn't upset. So in that case, he got 5, and Rebbe Shimon Rebbe got 2. And Rebbe Shimon Rebbe wasn't a problem. You got more than me, no big deal. You got 5, you got 2, we're good. So how come in regard to that fish incident, they seem to be super duper close friends that they didn't mind that it had to be equal? But by Yantif, by when they were splitting this animal on Yantif, they were makbid to split it up equally. So Amra Papa says Shtei Gavri Benayu. No, it was a different person. It wasn't the 2 of them. Reb Chia, Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi. It wasn't Reb Chia and Reb Shimon, the son of Rabbi. It was either Reb Chia and Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Shimon Rabbi uvar kapara, or it was Rabbi Shimon Rabbi and bar kapara. Okay. Any questions? Yeah. The Mishnah was talking about if you run out of meat on Yantif, or you need meat on Yantif. So the storekeeper is allowed to give you stuff, but you can't talk about prices and you can't weigh stuff in a regular way. And then we had a story, and then we talk about, and then there was a case where 2 people were splitting the meat. They were saying this one and this one are about the same size, so that's even. This one and this one is about the same weight, so we're even. They were splitting the meat. So it happened to be that the 2 people who split the meat, they seem to not be super close friends, because if they were super close friends, they wouldn't be so particular to split it evenly. So the question was there was a different case where these 2 people, one got 5 fish and one got 2 fish. So why were they not particular to distribute it equally in the case of the fish, but on the case of Yantif, they were very particular to split it equally? So at the very end here, the Gemara says we had the wrong 2 names. It wasn't Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi, and Reb Chia. It was either Reb Chia and Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi, or it was Rabbi Shimon. It was Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi, and Bar Kapara. But it wasn't the same two people. So that's why they weren't equally friendly about the meat and the fish. Is because because for the fish, it wasn't the people who were very close to each other. Therefore, the fish, they were very good friends. So you got more than me. I don't care. We're good friends anyway. But the ones who were splitting the meat on Yantif, they weren't such good friends, so they wanted to split it equally.
So I assume butchers always sold by the pound. Is that true? I assume.
Probably.
Okay.
Right, because they weigh. I mean, right. I mean, I don't think they sold the rack. You know what I mean?
Okay.
I guess you'd either sell a whole animal or by the pound. I guess, yeah. Okay. Now we're in the middle of Chav Ches Amud Aleph. In the English, it's 28a3, a new Mishnah. Ein mashchisen es hasaken b'yom tov. You're not allowed to sharpen the knife the regular way on Yantif. Aval masial gabi chaverta. You're allowed to lift it on top of another knife. So one thing I'm not sure, if you go to a shawarma place, the guys always go like this with the knife against each other. So if they're really sharpening it that way, then they couldn't do it on Yantif that way either, because that's the normal way they do it. Or if they just do it to make it look good, so then it's so. Okay, Gemara. Rav Huna lo shanu ela b'machsheres shel evet. Rav Huna says when you're not allowed to use the regular sharpening tool, which is usually a whetstone, that's if it's a stone one. If it's a wooden one, you're allowed to sharpen the knife on the wooden whetstone. Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel said, "Had Amar Til Even Aser." When we said you're not allowed to use a stone whetstone, lo amran ela lachadida. That's only to sharpen it. Aval lahaver shamnuni sa mutter. But if you're rubbing it against or not to sharpen it, but to get the fat that has accumulated on there off, that's permitted. Machlal, and that implies machlal de b'shel eitz afil lachadida nami mutter. That implies that if you're allowed to use the stone one to remove the fat off of the knife, so that implies that you're allowed to use a wooden whetstone for everything, even to sharpen the knife. Okay, so now we're just going to see a few other similar logics between the stone and the wood. Ikademasni la seifa. Some learned it on the second part of the statement of Rav Huna. B'shel eitz mutter. You're allowed to use a wooden whetstone. Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. So Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel said, "Had amar b'shel eitz mutter lo amar el haver shamni nusa." They only permitted the wooden one to remove fat off of the knife. But to sharpen it, you're not even allowed to use the wooden one whetstone to sharpen the knife. Machlal, that implies the b'shel even afila haver shamni nusa aser. That implies that you're not allowed to use a stone whetstone for anything, even if you're not trying to sharpen the knife, only to remove the fat off of it is forbidden. So I guess according to that, then the stone whetstone would be completely, it would be muksa on Yantif also, because there's no purpose, there's nothing mutter you could do with it. I don't think you'd be able to use it as a paperweight. I don't know. I mean, if it's a whetstone, it's probably pretty durable, but I don't know how much you're worried about it getting damaged, and then you wouldn't be able to have something to sharpen your knife with. Some said that this whole discussion that Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel's statement was on the Mishnah itself, not on the statement of Rav Huna. Ein mashchizin es hasaken b'yamtiv. You're not allowed to sharpen the knife on Yantiv. Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Lo shanu ela lachadida. That was only said in regard to sharpening it. Avol lahaver shamni nusa mutter. But if it's to remove the fat off of the knife, you're allowed to use it. Mechlal da agabi chaverta afilu chadida nami mutter. That implies that if you want to use one knife against another knife, even if it's to sharpen the knife, not just to remove the fat, but to sharpen the knife, nami mutter. That is also permitted. And now a fourth possibility, there's some who said that Rabbi Yehuda Mishmuel's statement was said on the seifa of the Mishnah. You're allowed to put the knives against each other. Rabbi Yehuda Mishmuel, Lo Shanu Ela Haver Shamni Nusa. Rabbi Yehuda Mishmuel said you're only allowed to do that to remove the fat off of the knife of al-chadida aser, but to sharpen the knife, you're not allowed to even put the knives against each other. So, but you're not allowed to use the wheat stone at all, even if it's only to remove the fat. So Montana de Mashchezes Aser. Who's the opinion that says that you're not allowed to use the whetstone? Because our Mishnah didn't have any Tana's name. So do we know whose opinion it is? So we're going to try to figure out whose opinion at least it isn't. Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says to Lo Rabbi Yehuda. It's not like Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. The Tanan. So the Tanya is a brisa, but it changed the gersa to Tanan that it's a Mishnah. And we mentioned this before, but we're going to mention it. It's really coming up a little bit later. Ein bein Yontif l'Shabbos al ochel nefesh bavad. There's no difference between Yontif and Shabbos, except that on Yontif you're allowed to prepare food for human consumption, which is usher on Shabbos, but it's mutter on Yontif. Rabbi Yehuda mater af Machshirei ochel nefesh. Rabbi Yehuda permits even preparations for food. So we're trying to say right here that to sharpen the knife is not needed to cook, but sharpening a knife is something that you use it's a step before cooking, a preparation. Machshirei ochel nefesh. So since Rabbi Yehuda permits Machshirei ochel nefesh on Yantif, so he would certainly allow you to sharpen the knife. Preparations for let's say grinding. Well, we spoke before about grinding spices. Is grinding something that has to be done now because it's better fresh, or it could be done beforehand? Sharpening a knife, possibly, and I'm not sure about this. Possibly grinding the wheat into flour. But Rabbi Yehuda might not agree with that because there might be different reasons why. Because we saw some of the Rishonim say that you usually do it in big quantities. So Chachamim said you can't do it, even though theoretically it wouldn't be usher, but preparation, or let's say, well, it's stuff that you could have done before Yontif. It's for cooking, but it's not actually part of the cooking process. Amar le Rabbi Rav Chisda. Rabbi said to Rav Chisda, Darshina mishma halacha Rabbi Yehuda. Can I say in your name that we pass with Rabbi Yehuda? Amar le Yehi Rabbi Nechol Ki Hani Mili Maliyasa Tidrishin Mishmai. May it be the will of Hashem. He didn't say that, but anything so good that I said, any good thing I say, you could say it in my name. Amar Rav Nechemia Bered Rav Yosef. Rav Nechemia said, the son of Rav Yosef said, Hava keimna kamei de Rava. I was in front of Rava on Yantif. Vahavi ka, as we turn to Chav Chesam Beis. Maver l'sakina apuma de dikla. He was rubbing a knife on the edge of a basket. So in our days, we would call it a wicker basket. I think in those days they used palm leaves probably to make a basket, similar to our kaichiklach on our lulav. That's I don't know. It's not the type of thing that you need to know to learn Gemara, but some people want to say what was the thing they were using. So this might mention it. Yeah, so the Koran says that these baskets were typically palm tree leaves. So Va'amri, I said to him, "L'chadira ka'abed mar, is the master doing this to sharpen the knife, or l'haver shamni nusa, or to remove the fat from it?" Meaning, he's trying to learn from the great man what what's mutter and what's not mutter. So Va'amar li l'haver shamni nusa. He says, "I'm doing it to get the fat off of the knife." V'chazisi l'daite del chadei ka'abed. But I saw what he was doing. He was really doing it to sharpen it. The Kasavar, and he holds halacha bin Morikain. He says we pass like Rabbi Yehuda that you're allowed to do preparations, but we're not allowed to tell the public this, because if they would know it, they would take it to an extreme and then include some things that shouldn't be done. So there is a concept that sometimes something is halacha bin Morikain, something is permitted, but we're not allowed to tell people because that halacha will be taken out of context or will be abused. Abaye said, Havakamimna Kamei Damar. I was in front of the master, his Rabbi. So the art scroll here says that normally it's Rabbah, but according to the Rashba is Rav Yosef. So I mentioned a couple weeks ago about that Abaye was a student of Rav Yosef. Also, that there was a case when Rav Yosef had gotten sick and forgotten some of the Torah that he had known before, and I mentioned that Abaye reminded him of what he taught him. So, was from one of his rabbis. Rashi doesn't say anything here. He was putting the knife on the lip of a millstone. So I think the problem is our Mishnah said mashchizen. So mashchizen, to sharpen it, normally would mean a whetstone, but we see there's a big machlokes if you're allowed to use the whetstone or not. And it's probably not mutter. So how could he be using this? So I think the Bartanura on the Mishnah asked this question, and I think, if I remember correctly, that he answers. So rechaya is something you grind with, but in this case, it wasn't a grindstone of a whetstone. It was something that they would grind the wheat with. So meaning the whetstone would definitely be usser. So he was using a different type of stone, which wasn't the regular stone, and that's why he was able to use it. One of the Achronim, the back of the Gemara mentioned that in the name of the Bartanura. The Havakamaver Sakina Sipsidrechaya, the Amrila, I asked him, Lachadra Kaboimar, does the master doing this to sharpen it, or Lahaver Shamninusa? Or you're doing it to remove the fat? Amarli, he said, Lahaver Shamninusa, I'm doing it to remove the fat. The Chazisi Ledaite de Lachadra Kavid, but I saw that the way he was doing it, his intention was really to sharpen it. Because ever halacha bein marikain. So it must be that he holds the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, that you're allowed to do even preparations, but you're not allowed to paskin it to people, or else people will abuse it. They won't do things when they should, and they'll do it all on Yom Tov instead of before, or they might do things that are a machshir to a machshir. Some things are 2 steps removed from cooking, and they might say, well, this is early pre-prep. Well, no, pre-prep is okay, but not pre-prep. They asked in the base medrash is following Shaila. Are you allowed to show the shechita knife to a chacham on Yom Tov? So there's there seem to be a couple halachas about this. One is basically whenever there was a new Rav in town, all the shachtim would have to come and, out of respect, go to the Rav and let the Rav feel their knives and make sure that their shechita knives are good. But it could also be sometimes, if they weren't a big expert yet, they weren't allowed to shecht with their own knife. So this I'm talking about even experts. When the new Rav came, they had to go and give it to the Rav. But people who weren't experts, they weren't allowed to use their own knives either unless it was approved by someone because they weren't experts enough. So can you show your knife to the Chacham on Yantif? Rav Mari Brei to Rav Bizna Shari. Rav Mari, the son of Rav Bizna, says you're allowed to show the knife to the Chacham. Rabbanan Asri, the Chachamim said you're not. Rav Yosef Amar Talmid Chacham Rola Atzman. Rav Yosef says the Talmid Chacham is allowed to check his own knife, umashila la'acherim, and then lend it to other people. So that means you're not allowed to ask a shaila about it. So Rashi says, what's the problem? Rashi says the problem is it looks like, because that's the way they do every day. If they're going to shecht during the week, they have to show the chacham, and then people know that they're going to bring meat into the. We mentioned a few weeks ago that about can you take a piece of meat, the animal on the stick, either one person or two people to carry it. Say no, that's making too big of a commotion. So that's even though it's not usher in regard to you're not doing anything that's against Yantif, but it's too big of a commotion, and Avshamilsa making a commotion on Yantif isn't okay, and it looks like regular market day almost, so it looks like a weekday thing. So Rashi says here the problem of showing the knife to the Chacham looks like it's a weekday thing. So just I want to mention a few opinions here. The Rashba mentioned several opinions here. The Rambam says that the problem is that if the Chacham says that it's not okay to use this knife, then someone is going to use a whetstone to sharpen it, and that's forbidden. So that's why we don't. So then the Rashba says, according to that, then it would only be a problem for an Amaretz because Amaretz will then use the whetstone. But someone who's not an Amaretz knows, okay, I can't shecht. I'm not allowed to use this, so I can't use my knife, and maybe I'll borrow it from someone else. But the Rashba doesn't like this opinion because then the Rambam should have had to say that this is only according to the Amaretz, and also the Gemara doesn't seem to be holding that way. The Gemara seems to say a blanket statement: can anyone show their knife? The Rif says that it's Xera. Maybe you're going to take it outside the Tchum, meaning you might live outside the Tchum, and so the closest rabbi to show your knife to is within the city limits, and you're going to be moving to a place where you're not allowed to carry the knife. And Balamor asks on that because in the Gemara in Shabbos, it implies that if Tchumim is only a Durabanan problem, you don't make a Gzera on the Durabanan. So therefore, the Balamor gives a third reason, and he says that checking the knife is almost like checking a Bechor for a blemish. If the knife is blemished, if the animal is blemished. And you're paskening if this knife is okay to use or not. Almost like paskening, is this Bechor, is the blemish on this Bechor a permanent one or not? And the Rashba doesn't like that answer either, because if so, a Talmid Chacham shouldn't be able to check his own knife on Yantif either, because he's not allowed to check even his own Bechor on Yantif. And Rashi says that it's because it's a commotion and it looks like weekday stuff, because it looks like you're going to sell stuff in the marketplace, and a Talmid Chacham is allowed to check himself in the house, because since he's not taking the knife outside, there's no commotion involved in getting the knife checked. And this also needs investigation because there's no prohibition for a butcher to shecht and sell on Yantif. And the Mishnah is going to say later on that he's allowed to shecht it. We're just not allowed to bring the animal or the knife to him. So a bunch of different possibilities about that. And then the Shita Beitza brings one other thing. Um, okay, so according to the opinion about that, it looks like a bechor. So the Rashba says then he shouldn't be a chacham shouldn't be able to check his own. So the Shittim Gevetza says that the Ritva gives an answer to that question and says that there's a difference. Is that um, a chacham isn't allowed to look at someone else's animal on Yantif because it seems like he's paskening a big shaila on Yantif. And by the way, Beis Din can't sit and on Shabbos or Yantiv either. But when a chacham is looking for its own thing, it's not such a big deal, and it has the same level as looking at a treifa. Meaning, you shafted anything. Oh, there's something on the lung. Is this a bad sircha on the lung, or is it not a problem? So, in regard to the chacham, it's not so basically saying according to a chacham would be, but according to this ritva, it seems that the chacham would be allowed to look at his own bechor on Yantif. And the Rebbe of the Ritva, which I thought it was the Ramban, but gave a better answer that bechor is different. That on a weekday the chacham isn't allowed to look at his own bechor, even if he's an expert. But he could check the knife for himself on Yantif because on a weekday he's allowed to check his own knife, and since on a weekday he's allowed to check his knife, it doesn't look like like you're pasking because you're not allowed to paskin about yourself. So it's when I say the word paskin, I have to. So, but when other people show it to him and ask, that looks more like a din, similar to bechor. So it's not that it's literally like a bechor, but it's similar to bechor that it needs to be checked. So there's two halachas. There's halacha of like testimony and things like that. You're never allowed to give testimony for yourself. Testimony things need psak, but there's a principle in halacha that eidach neman bisurim. For was this a kosher meat, or was it or this kosher fat, or is it chalef fat, which we're not allowed to have, or uh, is this part the truma or this part not the truma? You don't need real testimony. Even a woman is believed. So when it's just a minor thing, and that's why for a mashkiach, I mean, you will see in certain books, even maybe Rabbi Bleich in one of the first, maybe at volume 1, talks about it. But can a woman be a mashkiach or a mashkicha? There's no problem of woman being a mashkicha. But in regard to being a shochet, there, according to the Gemara, there doesn't seem to be any problem of a woman being a shochet. But they say we've never seen women being shachtim. And then there's an opinion from Eldad Hadani, who is a book called Sefer Eretz Yisrael, and he supposedly was from Africa, from one of the 12 lost tribes or something. He says women are not allowed to shaft, and I think Rav Yashaber, it's been a long time since I looked at it. I think being a shochet was more than just having a job; it was an appointment, and there's a law of in Srara, appointing people to official positions in the community, is that we learned from Melach, Som Tasimalacha Melach V'lo Malka, that you're not allowed to appoint a female in positions of authority. So a woman could be a shochet because that fell under the category of a community appointment. So that's not our topic, but I'm only saying in regard to Eidach Neman Bisurin, a woman is believed just like a man for those type of things, and there's no problem. Yeah, it tends to be that in a lot of places still men are mashkiach, but some restaurants or some stores you will find, yeah. I mean, at the Federation, after when they moved into the new building and they had milk, but they used to not have official kosher. When my father was there, it became CRC, and he was the mashgiach. But they only had fleishiks. And it wasn't when they moved into the new building, they had a milcha kitchen and a fleishik kitchen. He said, you're going to need someone full time if they're having both. So one of maybe not maybe the first or the second person, it was a lady as the mashgicha. So that's who they sent. So it is allowed. Whether how much it's used, I don't know. In Israel, would they allow that? I don't know. But in regard to the namanas, a woman definitely would have namanas, and in her own house, certainly you don't need a man to paskin. Oh, this part, you know, to say that this is. I know this is a piece we can't use. You know, so you don't, or this piece is okay. A woman would be believed. That's not real. Eidos isn't needed in a case like that. Okay, so we're the Amar of Yosef. Rav Yosef said, "Sakin sha'amda." A knife became not sharp anymore. Mutter l'chada b'yomtov. You're allowed to sharpen it. So obviously not in the normal way, but you're allowed to sharpen it. So Rashi says, okay, so this might still be talking about a shchita knife. The first time learning Gemara is not, but according to Rashi, it's amda literally means it stood, means that it stood from its sharpness. It doesn't cut well, but there is no pagam in it. So so if it's just a regular knife, who cares if it has a pagam or not? A pagam would be like a nick. But because Rashi says nifkama, I assume that according to Rashi, this is still talking about a shchita knife. It's not super sharp anymore, but there's not a problem. It's not going to make a treifa. If there's a nick in the knife, it's going to be a treifa. The animal's not going to be okay. So you're allowed to shecht it. So Rav Yosef says you're allowed to shecht it on Yantiv. So Rashi says even though yesterday or the day before it started getting duller, you should have done it before, but because it's still usable, it's not considered a major fix. You're allowed to do it on Yantif. But if it would have had a pagam before Yantif, there would be no way for us to fix to allow to give you a heter to sharpen it on Shabbos. Okay, I gotta run. Extension cord which was missing. I will be right back. I was hoping this would last. So from Rashi, it seems to be talking about a shchita knife. But let's learn the next line. I'm not so sure about that. The hani milihu de paska agav duchka. But that's if it's still usable if you use pressure. So the problem is that you can't shecht with pressure. I mean, you have to use a certain amount of pressure, but shchita has to be a back and forth movement. It can't be a pushing movement. So from that line, I assumed it was not talking about a shchita knife. So maybe it's talking about a regular knife, and a regular knife, even though there's not a problem if there's a nick in it. So I don't know. From Rashi, it seems it's a shchita knife, but from this line, the paska agav duchka, it wouldn't be a shchita knife because you're not allowed to shecht with a pushing motion. So I don't know. Darish Rav Chisda v'Tamer Rav Yosef. So in the English one, it's 28b1 now in the second column. And it's about 15 lines down in the Gemara. Darish Rav Chisda v'Tamer Rav Yosef. Rav Chisda taught, and some say it was Rav Yosef, Echad sakin shenifkama, whether it's a knife that had a nick in it, the echad shaput shenirtzam, or a shvud, it's like a thing with the sharp end that you like put the shish kebab on. They say a spit. That's not the word I was thinking of, but it's like a shish kebab pole type thing. But whether it's a big one that you could use for the Korban Pesach that you put the whole animal on, or whether a smaller one that you put other pieces of meat on, but the top, which is I guess the pointy part, broke off. So you can't really put the meat on it because you need to have the tip at the narrow tip at the end to poke the hole to get the stuff on it. The echad grifas tan of Yom Tov, or smoothing out the ovens on Yantif. Banu machlokes Rabbi Yehuda Rabbanan. We've come into the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan. Meaning, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's not for cooking itself. It's not for cooking itself. So according to Chachamim, you're not allowed to do these, to fix these things on Yantif. According to Rabbi Yehuda, that you're allowed to do preparations for ochel nefesh, you would be allowed to do these things on Yantif. The Tanya, because we learned in the Beitza, ein bein Yantif l'Shabbos ala ochel nefesh belvad. Rabbi Yehuda matter af Machshirei ochel nefesh. There's no difference between Shabbos and Yantif except food preparation. And Rabbi Yehuda says even preparation, except for preparing food for cooking. And Rabbi Yehuda says even preparations to make the food is okay. So it happens to be a machlokes between Rashi and Tosos in regard to sweeping out the oven. What are we talking about? Excuse me, not Rashi. Tosos brings several opinions that there's a machlokes. The Re says the problem is if you wipe it out, you are smoothing out holes, similar to what we spoke about sweeping a floor. That if you're sweeping a dirt floor, you're gonna sometimes there's a divot in the hole and you're smoothing it out. So if you clean out the stuff inside the oven, you're sweeping that out, you're smoothing it out, and that's probably made from ashes. And so the ashes may not be level, but that's the problem. And Tosos doesn't like this because it's not like the other cases, because it's usable without it, whereas the knife or the shish kebab pole, if they're broken, it's not usable at all. So it doesn't seem to be the same type of tikkun, of repair that you're doing. So therefore, he says we're talking about a brand new oven, and it still has stone and dirt because it wasn't fully lined it wasn't fully cleaned out on the inside yet. So when you remove them, it's like finishing the product, and it's makabapatif. It's the final hammer blow of an object. So one of the 39 malachos, it's not really doing anything specific, but whatever is the final act of cleaning of making something. So for the oven, the last thing is cleaning out the inside, getting any pebbles or whatever that's in there out. It's makabapatish. But then Tosfos asks, if so, taking out stones are muktzah. So therefore, the Ritzvah says that, and this is an important principle that Tosfos says many times in Beitza, moving something from muktzah is permitted for cooking on Yantif. So this is one of the proofs that Tosfos brings to that. So if you have something muktzah and you can't cook without moving that muktzah, you're allowed to move that muktzah thing. Probably in a different way, right? Kalachar yad, but that's a heter. If you need to move it in order to be able to cook, you're allowed to do that on Yantif. Okay, back in the Gemara. My time in Tanakama. So now this is a very important Gemara. What's the I mean, it's not Lamaisa really, but what's the basis for the Tanakama's opinion, for the Chachamim's opinion? Why are we allowed to cook on Yantif, unlike Shabbos? And why does Rabbi Yehuda, and why do they not allow you to do preparations for cooking? And why does Rabbi Yehuda learn that even preparations for cooking is mutter? That's what we're going to talk about in the next few lines. My time in Tanakama, what's the opinion of Tanakama that you're allowed to cook, but you're not allowed to do preparations for cooking? Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "Hu levado yaselachem." So the pasuk says, "Achasher yachal nefesh," but anything which is made for a soul, hu levado yaselachem. That alone can be done for you. So that velo Machshirei, but not preparations for it. So the cooking is okay, but not preparations. Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda, it says, hu velo Machshirei. How does he not learn that way? So Amar Kra lachem. It could be done for you. Lachem l'chol tzarchechem. All of the needs that you need to do for cooking, even the pre-prep stuff, is also allowed. So he focuses on the word lachem. So then the Gemara asks, "V'tanakama haksiv lachem." So according to the Chachamim, it says lachem. So why do they not learn lachem like Rabbi Yehuda? to allow pre-prep stuff. So Amar Lacha, Hahu Lachem V'lo L'Nachrim. They need that to teach you good for you, but not for non-Jews, which we mentioned about this a while ago. Lachem V'lo Lovdei Kachavim. Now, I saw someone say that Rabbi Yehuda has to agree with this also. Rabbi Yehuda, who, even though he allows Machshirei, ochel, nefesh preparations for cooking food, he does not allow cooking for non-Jews either. So he learns both things from Lachem. But also, when we learned about this before, I think at Daf Chaf Aleph, we mentioned that one opinion learned several drashos. Lachem v'lo l'nachrim, lachem v'lo l'klavim. Are you allowed, so domesticated animals that depend on you to feed them, are you allowed to cook for them on Yantif? So there is a drasha about that. So even according to other people, there might be understood that we learn multiple drashos from the word lachem. Okay, ve'ida chaksiv hu, but according to the other one, meaning Rabbi Yehuda, it says hu. Only that can be done. So why does he allow more than just cooking? It says only that, hu levado. So amalacha ksiv hu ksiv lachem. It says that, but it also says for you. V'lo kasha. It's not a contradictory. It's not a difficulty. Kan b'machshir she'after lasosim me'erav yantav. We can b'machshir she'after lasosim me'erav yantav. Here's when your things that can be done before yantav, that you're not allowed to do. But if it's things that can't be done before yantif, that I allow you to do on yantif, even though it's not directly related to the food, but it's a preparation for the food. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda said the name of Shmuel. Shpud shenertzaf. If the shish kebab pole, and when I'm saying this, it might be like a whole roasting pole. You put a big chunk, or maybe even a whole goat, on the spit, and you would turn it. If that got bent, you're not allowed to fix it on yantif. Pshita, obviously, you're not allowed to fix it on yantif. Lo tricha dafagav demashri biyade, even if you could do it by hand. So if you're fixing it by hand, it must not be one that's for a whole animal, because that would be too thick and too heavy to do by hand. That would make it sound like it's more of a smaller shawarma pole that's you could straighten with your hand. But still, even though it's with your hand, you're not allowed to. Okay, so just a few more lines. If you use one of these poles and you already roasted meat on it, also you're not allowed to move it on yantif afterwards, because once you used it, it's dirty and it's disgusting, so now it's muktzah. Rav Ada bar Ava Amar Rav Malkio. Rav Ada bar Ava said the name of Rav Malkio. Shom tom manicha b'keren zavis. You can kind of move it in an irregular way, but put it in the corner. You don't have to leave it out. Ramar Rav Chia bar Rav Ashi Amar Rav Huna. Rav Chia bar Ashi said the name of Rav Huna. V'hu sheish alav kazayis basar. And as long as there's a kazayis of meat on it. Now this is very difficult, because we learned earlier that if there's you shechted an animal and you separated the hide from the meat, you're only allowed to move the hide if there's a kazayas on it. Because if it's kazayas, it's still edible, so you're allowed to move it. So if you roasted this meat already and there's still a kazayas on the shpud, that's completely edible kazayas meat. There shouldn't be mutz at all. So that's a question about this statement over here. Ravina Amar Afapisha Ain Alav Basar Motul Tatlo Mida Havi Akotz Purshus Rabbin. Ravina says even if there's no meat on it, you're allowed to move this thing, Midi Havi Akotz Purshus Rabbin, as if there'd be thorns in the Rishus Rabbin. You're allowed to move it Kalachar Yad in order that no one hurts themselves on it. So we'll leave it here. We're out of time.